the Chess Lab. Super excited to show you guys this game today between Magnus Carlsen and Nils Grandelius, played in round 9 of the Tata Steel Masters tournament. Magnus Carlsen coming off a loss, a rest day, he's just going to be an absolute beast, and Nils Grandelius is in for a huge fight today. So let's just jump straight into the game. We have e4, c5, a Sicilian, knight to f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes, knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4, knight to c3, a6, and here we enter the Sicilian defense Najdorf variation, which means we are going to get the battle and fight we wanted with Magnus. And here with queen to d3, Magnus throws in the first punch with this move. And to tell you the truth, it's not even in my database, but I'm sure Grandelius has done some work here and he is going to be very well prepared. But before we continue, let's examine real quick some of the ideas behind this move. One of the things Magnus wants to do is maybe come here with queen to g3, put pressure on the pawn on g7. So in some situations, this black king is going to castle kingside. Castling queenside is very dangerous. And Magnus might follow this up with h4, h5, maybe some move to g5, h6, some combination like this. This is what Magnus had in mind by playing this move to d3. Grandelius continues with pawn to e6, and Magnus continues with a4, a common move against this e6 setup, also preventing the expansion of b5 by black in this position. Knight to c6, knight captures, and pawn captures on c6, and this new pawn structure is all in white's favor, since there will always be a weakness here on a6, and the space advantage that Magnus has gives him a slight but powerful plus in this position. Magnus continues with queen to g3. As we mentioned, this is one of the ideas here, and Grandelius goes for bishop to b7. Very interesting move, not going for the thematic break in the center with d5, but simply developing his bishop to the long diagonal, which he plans to use later in the game. Magnus continues bishop to e2, bishop to e7 by Grandelius, and bishop to f4 by Magnus. A very good move before castling to create some weaknesses in the black position. And these are the type of moves that actually separate the strong grandmasters from the weak 2500 grandmasters. And I say weak, but come on, they're 2500. But okay, these are the type of moves that you need to make to reach that extra level. Grandelius goes for e5, and Magnus goes back with bishop to e3. Now, if instead of e5, for example, by Grandelius, maybe he would have gone for this move, castle, instead. And this would be really bad. And this is what Magnus, he was poking with this bishop to f4. If castles, then rook to d1. Now there's going to be a triple attack on this pawn by the bishop and the queen also. And if you go e5 now, this just simply loses a pawn after bishop takes e5, taking advantage of this pin down the d5. But all right, Grandelius didn't go for this, so he plays e5, and Magnus goes bishop to e3, and both sides simply castle here, and Grandelius goes for king to h8, a beautiful prophylactic move, getting out of the way of any bishop to h6 maneuvers that Magnus could possibly have, also preparing the way for knight to d7, and to play this move f5 in the future. Here Magnus continues with f5, and this pawn move is very thematic in this type of position, fixing the pawn on a6, which is going to be a weakness for the rest of the game. In some situations, also preparing this bishop to come to b6, or maybe this knight to a4, knight to b6 maneuver is also possible here. Grandelius goes for knight to d7. As we mentioned, one of the ideas behind this prophylactic move king to h8 was to go knight to d7, and this knight from d7 also protects the square on b6, so it's very useful to have the knight there. Here Magnus continues with rook f to d1, just putting some pressure down the d-file and centralizing the rook, of course. And Grandelius, of course, breaks and attacks the center with f5. Magnus has no choice but to take on f5, allowing this pawn to, let's take a quick move back, allowing this pawn to come to f4. Obviously, attacking both of these pieces is not something he wanted, so he goes for e takes f5, and Grandelius here goes for d5. A great intermezzo move, not capturing the pawn on f5 right away with rook takes f5. Here, of course, Magnus goes for knight to f4. If we take a look, this pawn move d4 is going to be catastrophic, so he needs to do something about this. So he goes knight to a4, d4 by Grandelius, bishop d2. Magnus comes back with the bishop, gets it out of harm's way from the pawn on d4, and also protects the pawn on a5. And Grandelius goes for c5. And to be honest, white is up a pawn, but black has freed up his position. He controls the center, and black's bishops suddenly look very strong. Here Magnus goes for queen to h3, and I guess for his troubles, he's trying to just keep the pawn, his extra pawn, for as long as possible. Bishop to g5, and this move is just awesome. Grandelius is trying to trade his bishops, go queen to g5, in which case this rook will take the pawn on f5, and this bishop on b7 is going to have, it's just going to be a monster. Bishop takes g5, queen takes g5 by Grandelius, rook to e1 by Magnus, and bishop to e4. Now, in reality, I understand the move, but it doesn't look very good. Maybe capturing the pawn on f5 with the rook would have been a lot better. Since now, after bishop to e4, Magnus can trade the light square bishops, and just trading these two bishops is just going to be good for white, period. Magnus goes for bishop to d3, bishop takes f5, and rook takes on f5. Magnus continues with knight to b6, a very nice move, and Nils has to actually take the knight on b6. Had he gone for a move like rook d8, this would have lost the pawn after rook takes knight takes d7, rook takes d7, rook takes on e5, taking advantage of the pin, rook takes on e5, and queen takes on d7, winning a pawn, and probably just the game, since there's going to be a lot of checkmate threats in the back rank as well. So after a takes b6, h6 by Grandelius, queen to d3, putting double pressure here on the pawn on a6, rook to b8, Magnus captures the pawn on a6, and rook to f6. And this was black's idea in order to recapture the pawn back. But Magnus takes advantage of a very small, little subtle trick that he had. And this practically is the move that wins the game for him. After g3, which is the move Magnus plays, Grandelius falls for this trick. And I should mention, at this moment in the game, both players were very long time. They had less than 5 minutes, and they were just blitzing out their moves. So after these trades on b6, here comes the shocker, where Magnus goes for the pawn to f4. And this was, of course, the point behind the move to g3. And this pawn on f4 cannot be captured because of a nasty checkmate on the back rank. So here, queen to d8 had to be played, and Magnus just picks up a pawn. And from now on, the endgame magician is just going to put on a masterpiece. Rook takes b2, rook takes on c5, and queen to a8. And black wants to take advantage of the weaknesses around the white king. All these light square weaknesses plus the bottom rank. So Magnus has to act quickly, and he goes for king to f2, rook to b8. Now, any other move besides this rook move, and this rook would have come in there with check, and it would have been checkmate. Not to mention the pawn on d4 was also dropping. So after queen to f3 here by Magnus, queen to a7, of course, Grandelius doesn't want to trade queen since he's down a pawn. Queen to d5, and with both centralized rook and queen, and the d4 pawn about to drop, this is just close to losing for black here. He goes for queen to a1, and I think this is the last mistake that Grandelius made in the game. If you want to save positions like this, you want to have as much activity as you possibly can, even if you're down a pawn. In order to do this, the idea for black in this position should have been to go for this pawn to d3. And if pawn takes on d3, then this opens the entire second rank for you to attack the king. And this is probably what Grandelius should have played in order to create enough counterplay for him to save himself in this game. But after queen to a1, just queen to e5, Magnus starts attacking. And as I mentioned earlier, if you wanna be able to defend these kind of positions, you need to be attacking, not defending. And he puts Grandelius in a complete bind, and he just can't move. After queen to e5, queen to b2, rook to c6, attacking the pawn on h6, taking advantage of this pin. Grandelius goes for king to h7, and here Magnus goes for rook to c7. And Grandelius has to go for rook g8. If d3 here, trying to liberate the position, Now this loses to queen to f5, king h8, rook c8 check, and after the trades, we take the pawn on d3, and this is just a technical win. After rook to g8, Magnus goes for king to d2, queen b4, queen e4 check, king h8, and rook d7. As I mentioned, although this is move 41, the last few moves, the players only had seconds, and they were just blitzing other moves. So they were probably not the most accurate ones. Queen to d2 check, king to h3, queen d1, rook to e7. Magnus is just shuffling, trying to find the best way to get in, trying to put his pieces in the best squares that they could possibly be. Grandelius throws in a check with queen to h5, king returns to g2, rook to c8, trying to activate his pieces, f5 by Magnus, queen to d1. Now there's a double threat here on the pawn on c2, so Magnus has to go for the rook trade with rook takes, queen takes, king there. They repeat the position a couple times. King h7, queen g6, king to h8, and f6 here by Magnus with the simple threat of queen takes on g7, checkmate, and also trying to disrupt the pawn structures for black here. Queen to e2 check, king to h3, queen to e6 check, and king to h4. And wait, isn't black just simply winning the pawn back? Not really. G takes f6 had to be played. If queen takes on f6, this move loses to queen takes f6, pawn takes, king g4, king g7, h3, king f5, king f4, king to e6, and after king to e4, this pawn is going to drop, this pawn is going to become a queen, and it's just game over. So instead, after g takes f6, Magnus captures on h6 with check, king to g8, queen g6 check, king to f8, and Magnus here chose why he is the endgame master and the best player in the world, period. He goes for this move, g4, and the magician is just doing his work. Queen to e5, attacking the pawn on h2, and maybe asking some questions to Magnus. h3, and this pawn shield combination with the pawn on g4, h3, and actually this pawn on f6 by black just gives white a very solid position, and it's very hard for black to actually give any good checks here. For example, any checks here on e1, this king is simply going to run to h5, h6, and these pawns are going to come to h4, and the shield around the king is just going to be very safe for white there. But of course, after h3, king to e7 by Grandelius, Magnus continues with queen to f5, and now the king can cross this fifth rank, since actually the queens cannot be traded because it's just a technical win by white. So once the queen moves, this king is just going to march into the position. Queen to e3, king to h5, giving the h3 pawn, but getting access to the g6 square. Queen takes on h3 check, king to g6, king to d6, and here king takes on f6, and now the g pawn is going to just decide the game by pushing itself forward. Grandelius here comes back with the queen. He needs to try to get active and give some checks if possible. Magnus continues with g5, but after queen to e7, king g6, queen e8, king to g7, queen to e7 check, king to g8, a great king maneuver, and now any checks on the last rank is gonna white's just gonna go queen to f8, which will give a counter check on the king, and this game is simply over, and Grandelius resigned. Magnus is now +1 again in the tournament, and tomorrow he will be facing the co-leader of the tournament and second highest rated player in the world at the moment, Mr. Fabiano Caruana, and it will be an absolute great battle there. I want to thank everybody for watching. If you like content like this, like and subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave a comment down below, and as always, stay safe, have a great day, and show respect to your opponent. See you next time.